Hello, I'm Tim Smart, President of BT Global Services in the UK. BT Global Services is BT's networked IT services company serving enterprises and governments around the world. And we're delighted to be hosting the first of a series of Big Thinkers conversations. Today, we have invited onto the panel David Burden, the CIO of Royal Mail in the UK, and Andrew Vorster, the CIO of Visa in Europe. They are two companies which in themselves have taken part in radical business model changes. We have also invited David Butcher from BT's CIO department. BT itself is undergoing a radical transformation, both in terms of cost base, services, and business model, and I'm delighted that David's able to join us. This is the first in a series. It's a series that's been conceived as a way to bring together panelists from around the world to have conversations with experts around interesting and challenging and innovative business issues. We are also delighted that today we're using an innovative platform which we think, given restrictions on time and travel, will help people participate in this series and others, and to benefit from technology in a way that enables them to be far more productive. Today's eForum is broadcast live from Google's headquarters in Silicon Valley, California, where Dr. Eric Schmidt, Chairman and CEO of Google, will lead the panel with our moderator and series host Esther Dyson, a renowned digital technology visionary and author. So with thanks, I'd like to hand over to Esther, who will now lead the discussion.
Hello, everybody, and good morning, Eric. I'm not going to say hello to the audience, good morning to the audience, because they're all over the world. And the way we're going to run this is Eric and I are going to chat. We will be aware when people are calling in with questions, and so we can have kind of a conversation. And the goal here is to be interesting and to uncover some new ideas. I'm going to really look at three topics in basic order, but it's not going to be too strict. And the first is managing Google. The second is the products and services Google offers. And then the third is Google and the world and your impact. And that's both your impact on business and your impact in places like China or the Middle East and so forth. So first of all, thanks for showing up on a Monday morning.
Well, thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure. It's nice to be here at Google, though we're actually in a kind of enclosed space here. I want to start out simply by asking you what you found when you came to Google. You were at Sun as CTO, you were at Novell as CEO, and now you're here as CEO. If you can compare and contrast, you might want to be delicate in references, I don't know, but give us a sense of what you found when you came.
Well, I was struck by how different the cultural model was. And it seemed to me that somehow Larry and Sergey had assembled a new generation of technology leaders who seemed very young to me. And if you listened to them and you didn't remind yourself how young they were very interesting. They had a different view of how information would be organized. And I've come to understand that there is a sort of new generation of people who've come along who take for granted that disk drives have infinite capacity and that the networks are infinitely fast, and they want to change the world because of it.
So if you had come to Sun Micro not as the young guy you were then, but as someone your age, do you think Sun was Sun a move forward in the same way, or is Google really something different?
I think each of the iconic technology companies start off the way Google and Sun did, which is with a different model. In Sun's case, which I was fortunate to be part of the early years of, it was clear that there was a new way of organizing platform computing. The workstation had just been invented and so forth. And it was really the confluence of a new computer architecture, but the internet itself was not really fundamentally a part of that vision. It was really a replacement for mini computers and so forth. But the software was different, and the way that people worked was different. What's funny about Google today is we have exactly the same kind of people we had at Sun, but the 20-year younger model of them. the same kind of crazy engineers who work all night and sleep all day, the same kind of odd sense of humor sometimes, and the same kind of sense that there's something more than just a technology company at work.
Yeah, but there also seems to be something even more than Google was the network is the computer, but here there seems to be more social content to the technology change because it's about transparency. And
you can make the argument that this is really a natural progression of technology, that 30 years ago the great startups, Intel being an obvious example, many others, were fundamentally working on underlying technology, operating systems, chips, networking, and so forth. Google is one of a series of companies that were founded in the 1990s and 2000s, which are fundamentally about how people use computers. It's interesting that Apple is the iconic example of this, because Apple was founded both as a platform company but also as a change the world company. So there are examples from a long time ago where people were concerned about human sensibilities. But now, with information being so incredibly, profoundly available, right, the problem is not whether the computers talk to each other, because of course they do. It's what do you do with that information.
Yeah. And so in a sense, with the technology you can do anything, but now you need to figure out policies and rules. And
another way of saying it is that when I was a graduate student, the people who did the kind of information analysis that's done here every day by the physicists, mathematicians, and computer scientists at Google was considered a rather odd activity. It was like going to the library because there was so little information that you could actually manipulate. So people would do all sorts of interesting analyses and we'd say, oh, that's kind of interesting, but no one will ever use it because it wasn't there. But now the underlying computing platform is so incredibly powerful and so amazingly strong that it's possible to build these amazing information architectures.
Right, so you can do the things like the link analysis that gave Google its initial page rank.
But more importantly, the link analysis, which was Larry Page's research work, which ultimately became Google, was just the beginning of a passion to analyze information very profoundly. It is possible to look at all of the world's information and discern all sorts of interesting things. We have people who are trying to figure out emergence of new diseases, for example, to track interesting aspects of human behavior, social and political discussions. These would never have been possible without the ability to aggregate all the information in the first place.
Yeah, so let's just finish a little more about the managing side. You have, by all accounts, a huge unruly group of smart wizards all over the place. And you know, the question is how there was just an article in Fortune about managing on the edge of chaos. And if you were to just skim it, you'd think, well, gee, all Eric does is kind of preside while all these chaotic things self-organize. But the fact is some chaotic systems do self-organize and some don't. You can have a chaotic system that just stays random. What is it you do that makes things self-organized within Google?
Well, we always run the company as though 3 of the 4 wheels on the train are off the rail, and there's only one on. And there's only one on, and that's by design, because we understand that it is a race, and it is a race to get all of this information organized in ways that really affect, in a positive sense, the way people think about information. And again, Larry and Sergey, when I first started, said there will be at least one company. And they didn't talk about Google's size today, but they understood that this was a scale business. So we organized ourselves around scale. And there's this relatively simple way of thinking about it. Most problems will solve themselves in a collaborative culture because eventually, if somebody's making a mistake, somebody else will correct them. So the first rule is
if you let them.
If you let them.
Yeah.
So the first rule is to make sure people are talking to each other. So we have numerous guidelines. We use a principle called 70-20-10. 70% of our investment is in our core business, 20% in our adjacent business, 10% in other new ideas. And we rigorously check that. That keeps us prioritized, right? Another thing we do is we try not to have individual decision makers. We try not to have too much hierarchy. Most companies, especially in the technical world, as they get older, become more and more hierarchical. They get more and more layers of management and relatively little creativity. We try to be not too hierarchical. We try to have decisions made by more than one person, because it means somebody has to check the other and talk to them and convince them. And then finally, every once in a while, something actually really bad happens. and then we talk about it and we take direct action if we need to.
So you learn from mistakes.
And we learn, and you make lots of mistakes.
Yeah.
One of the principles here is that the quicker you can make the mistake, the quicker you can get the next opportunity. In American baseball, people say this is having more at-bats.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of studies of genius and great performers, which the company aspires to be at a corporate level, say that you should have as many at-bats as possible. You won't hit as many home runs, but as you might, but you want to just keep going and going and going.
And so do you think, the answer is, of course, both, but how much is it the people you select? Because you're also well known for your rigorous hiring process and so forth. How much is it the people, and how much is it the structure and the rules and the, if you like, the culture?
It's obviously both, but remember that there's a selection bias, because when people interview at Google, we subject them to the very, very difficult interviews, and we give them tests. So everyone who interviews at Google has a test. The salespeople have to sell, the marketing people have to do marketing, the engineers have to write code, the managers have to write an essay on managing and what they're going to do in the company. And of course, we don't tell them, we throw that out afterwards. Yeah. The important point is everybody is tested. And so people who don't want to go through that don't come. And it's pretty clear that the people who come are reacting positively to the culture. When I looked around to what I wanted to do next, I visited Larry and Sergey and Google. This is where I wanted to be. Mm-hmm. And it didn't occur to me that there was another place that I wanted to be. This was too important an opportunity. And I believe that today.
So how have things changed since you came? You went public, obviously.
In many ways, it's the same. And many people don't believe this, but it's the same people. Most of the executives in the company, more than half of the vice presidents, for example, are among the first 50 employees. So in many ways, we've all worked together for a very long time. A lot of people assume that going public would change the company in some fundamental way. In many ways, I think that going public has made the company more successful. It's given us a lot more capital, given us a lot more visibility, allowed us to recruit people who would not have come to a private company but wanted the stability and impact of a public company. So I think most of us believe that the scale and growth of the company has been real positive, and most people have stayed.
And the transparency hasn't been a hindrance, or?
The transparency is almost always good. There have been a couple of cases where we would have preferred not to give out information for competitive reasons. We had held off going public until the last possible minute. We actually announced our going public 2 hours before we were legally required to file the document that was the equivalent of going public.
Good job you didn't miss the 2 hours.
Well, we knew the deadline, and we follow the law. So we did it at 11 o'clock, and the filing was at 1. Mm-hmm. But in any case, the important thing is once we decided we did it well.
Yeah. We have a question from Tim Smart, who I think will call in. We'll find out. But the transparency, what about the personal transparency? Is that a challenge?
In the 90s, the media became obsessed with people rather than companies. And my own view is that Google is a system. And since we've agreed that the objective of Google is to have a great franchise that far outlasts all of us, something that has tremendous impact around the world, I believe the most important thing is to focus on what the company is doing. The individuals will come and go, and not everyone lives forever as much as we would like. So the fact of the matter is Google is a systematized approach to innovation around a space that is central to what people want to do in the world. And we intend to do that very well for a very long time.
Yeah, that's true, but still we live, maybe this is the third section, but we live in this transparent world where people are obsessed with individuals, and
But that doesn't make it right.
No, it doesn't make it right.
The company, people come to the company to serve the company.
Yeah.
And this is not Hollywood.
Fair enough. Thank God. Mm-hmm. Okay, now Tim Smart's question is, I'm going to have to read it off the screen, but it's not on the screen, so if someone can put it up on the screen again, I will. Here we go. How do Google, Microsoft, Oracle, companies led by innovative thinkers, encourage their people to innovate and to be challenged when they're inclined to be wowed by the leaders? I guess this is exactly what we're saying. How do you, you and Larry and Sergey are so smart. How do you make sure that they're not too deferential?
Well, first place, the smartest people in the company are never its leaders.
Right.
The smartest people in the company, there's always, in these large companies, there's always somebody whose IQ is smarter than any of the other people that you know. The problem is you often don't know who that person is, because they're
Yes.
deep in some organization.
Or they're weird.
Or they're unusual,
Yes.
et cetera. In a well-functioning organization, the top performers do what they do because they want to have an impact. And so with average people may or may not be incentivized by the things, but I can tell you that one of the fundamental lessons of Silicon Valley is that great people want to have an impact. And so if you think of yourself as an executive, your job is to find a way for them to have an impact. So as an example, Google spends a great deal of money on data centers. This is public knowledge,
Yeah.
and we do that because it's roughly equivalent of building cyclotrons. If you're a physicist, you have to go where the cyclotron is, or the equivalent technology today, because you need to do your research on a cyclotron. Well, if you're a computer scientist and you want to work on information, you need the best equipment. And we say to our employees, if you come to Google, or prospective employees, if you come to Google, you'll have access to that. It drives them in a way that's much stronger than any kind of traditional management. Another example is the do no evil argument.
Yeah.
Most people at Google seem to be here for reasons other than normal employment and compensation. They're happy to have normal employment and
Yes.
compensation and
good
benefits
food.
and good food and so forth. But if you talk to them, the reason they're at Google is because they think it matters and that the other choices that they have don't matter as much. So high-performing, impact-oriented organizations are really built around spirit and the sense of impact that they can have. And this, by the way, transcends just technology. It would be true in many other industries as well.
Yeah, but I think the question was also how you get, say, your middle managers to listen to the. I know this is a very hierarchical sounding question, but it's everything you're saying is true. But you now have a lot of people there, and how do you make sure that someone doesn't squash them?
Well, one of the things we try to do is we try to have as few managers per employee as
Fair
possible.
enough, yes.
So we keep our managers overloaded, and they really are overloaded. They'll have 40, 50 direct reports, which is way beyond the norm. So that makes it difficult for the managers to squash innovation. They sort of run around and do their best to help people out.
And so they troubleshoot rather than manage.
They troubleshoot, they lead, they get people excited. It's a much better model than I have 3 people and I walk in the morning and I tell them what to do, which is the old style. And that doesn't work very well. Probably doesn't work well in most industries, and it certainly doesn't work very well here. The other thing we do is we encourage people to operate in large meetings. We try to make decisions in front of everyone. Mm-hmm. We try to have a lot of conversation. There's a lot of literature on this. There's a book called The Wisdom of Crowds,
Yes.
for example, from 2 years ago, that actually documents this pretty carefully. And what it says, which is quite interesting to read in hindsight, is that the highest performing organizations are driven by teams, not individuals, and those teams are consensus managed with deadlines. So what happens is you have a meeting. And if everyone is nodding and agreeing, you've got a problem. But if you can get somebody to disagree, and then you can have a big discussion or argument, as we say, and then at the end of the argument, if you're the executive, make the decision and make it in front of everybody. Everyone buys in. It's a much better way of running things.
Right, and everybody knows what objections were raised and that they were dealt with, and so you can move on.
A lot of the cultural issue, which I've seen in other companies and we've tried to avoid, has to do with whether the individuals in the meeting are worth hearing from. And we run the company with the presumption that everyone in this meeting has an independent and interesting opinion, and we need to hear from them. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they get to win in the discussion. But if you treat them that way, culturally, then everything else works just fine.
Right, so they're heard.
They're heard.
Do you ever have to appoint someone to be a devil's advocate or something?
Not usually. If things are too quiet, usually Larry and Sergey will be appropriately exciting,
Yeah.
and then something will happen.
Fair enough. Okay, well, so let's talk now a little bit about the products and services.
Sure.
There's sort of, I heard someone say the other day that you organize the world's information, and you collect, you survey, you analyze the world's information, but you leave it pretty much in place. And then you create a framework through which people can find it. to me, that's really, really interesting. But the next thing I think you're probably going to have to do is personalize, help each person create their own little framework for looking at the world. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, let's talk about it in the context of
Okay.
the last 10 years of the Internet. Internet, of course, is more than 30 years old, but now, of course, with this tremendous explosion in personal computers and disk drives and so forth, everyone is an author, everyone is a writer, everyone is a publisher. And this had a lot of impact on society as a whole, and it's likely to continue. In particular, it means that there is a tremendous amount of new content being generated. New content from professionals, new content from amateurs. And all of it needs to be sorted through, ranked, and so forth. And that's, of course, what Google does. So when we say that our mission is to organize all the world's information, we understand that that's a mission that's never done.
Right.
It's not like if everyone would just stop producing information, we could get it organized tomorrow. So the rate of information production, which is the supply of what Google does, seems to be ever increasing and increasing at this amazing rate, which is wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So from our perspective, the trick is, how can we take the many, many, many billions of pieces of information that are being generated and organize them? Well, we started with PageRank, which, as you know, is the underlying ranking algorithm for Google. And then we used many, many other algorithms to do that, and that's why our answers are considered so good
Right.
and the best around. We also have the largest indices, and in the most languages, the highest quality. We've recently expanded to include multimedia, so things like video and audio are on the docket in various forms. Getting all that organized makes sense. The next question is, how do we do it even better for you as an individual? Well, if all we know is you walked up to an internet computer in the airport and you just started typing, we don't know who you are.
Right.
But it's possible, with your permission, and this
Yes.
is very important,
Yeah.
to figure out a little bit about when you say hot dog, you actually mean the food hot dog as opposed to a hot dog.
Yes. Or a sausage in a bun, as they would say in England.
Sausage in a bun, same argument. And there are many examples in the English language where there's ambiguity. The problem is worse in some other languages where the ambiguity is fundamental to cognition and understanding how the sentences work. So the more targeting we can get about your person, the better the results can be.
Yeah, and it's not even just ambiguity. It's things like you type in Brazil. That's not ambiguous. Right. But are you interested as a tourist? Are you interested as a historian, a politician?
Well, or maybe you're looking at the London Theatre show called Brazil.
So missed that one. Yes.
My point is that almost every query
Right.
has some level of ambiguity. So one of the things that we can do is we can tailor the results better to you with your permission if you let us track you or tell us a little bit about you. The other aspect of personalization is the inverse, which is where people are submitting personal information. And they want their personal information to also be indexed. And we have some products to do that. So the easiest way to think about it is that 5 years ago, the future of Google was more information, more personalized information, more accurate search on every device you could be. It's exactly the same answer today. It's just much bigger.
Yeah. But this whole area of personalization is huge. And I'm not really sure. My sense is that precisely because you're so visible, you tend to not want to talk about it as much as other people might because it always raises privacy issues. But it seems to me that when you look, for example, at the question of click fraud, if you have personalization, you know whether the person clicking on the ad is a real person or some machine. If you have personalization, an advertiser may not know the individual's name, but it knows that this person travels a lot and perhaps spends a lot of money and has clicked, and not just clicked, but also bought things through other. So you have from the point of view of the advertiser, where the money comes from, you have a much more interesting proposition because you know the demographics and you know the behavior of who's clicking on the ad, so that the whole internet world, and especially the monetization side of it, changes dramatically. It seems to me that that's where we're heading.
Well,
I'm curious.
We've been careful to separate
Right.
the two.
Yeah.
We work very hard to keep a boundary between the natural search results, or whatever you want to call them, which are produced without commercial influence,
Right.
and the ranking of the ads, which are very much influenced by economics. We have a product called Google Analytics, which allows arbitrary websites to track clicks and so forth and so on. An example would be that information would be incredibly useful for our other systems,
Right.
but we have not allowed that information to bleed into our other systems because it would violate our terms of service. And the obvious next question that people say is, well, but you could change that.
Right.
Right, you could somehow become evil, or maybe a new version of you could become evil.
Well,
and the answer turns out to be that Google is a success because of the trust of our end users.
Yeah. But you could also say to your end users, if you care to be listed without your name but be demographically identified, you'll get these and these benefits, including much more relevant to you search results and maybe special offers from whatever. As long as the person agrees and wants it, it seems to me it makes a whole lot of sense. There's a lot of behavioral targeting networks coming up, and it just seems to me inevitable for a lot of areas that this is going to be more and more widespread.
We have decided to be very careful about that area.
Clearly.
And I'm sure that people will do much more than we would ever.
Right.
And the reason is it's so easy to abuse it.
Yeah.
It's so easy for insufficiently anonymized data to become available for other computers to track this and discover who you are. There have been a number of cases of that.
AOL recently.
AOL most recently. And it's an ongoing problem.
Yeah.
And so we have a policy that we won't do that sort of thing without being absolutely sure that we can maintain the trust of our end users.
Yeah. But if you were an analyst looking at the market, wouldn't you say that's going to become increasingly prevalent?
I'm sure in aggregate it will.
Yeah.
The most interesting businesses, which again flout these privacy issues, have to do with building, for example, marketing campaigns.
Yeah.
It'd be very, very interesting if you knew where everyone was clicking. You could be able to predict, for example, what would be the hottest toy for Christmas, which would be of a great economic value. But in order to do that, you'd have to violate the privacy of an awful lot of people.
Well, if you just know how many people are clicking, it's
again,
not as valuable.
Again, the more targeted the marketing information, the more likely the violation of privacy. So again, we've chosen to take a tough line on that.
Okay, well, it will be interesting to watch as this whole thing keeps going. Now, we have another question, which I guess is also not a call-in. It's from David Burden at Royal Mail. And he asks, people think that disk drives are unlimited and networks are fast, but large companies still run on old networks. Can Google's model work inside corporations? And I'm not sure whether this is about the management model or just the model for sorting, probably the model for sorting information.
Well, let's talk about a couple of things.
Yeah.
First place, the aspects of the way Google is managed are clearly universal for managing high-performance technology scientific people, because they have, this is the way in which they seem to be most productive. So I think that model certainly translates to other companies. With respect to using information and using information internally, virtually every problem that Google has solved generically is also true inside of a company. Indeed, we have a number of products which you can put inside your company to build essentially Google inside your company, so-called Google Search Appliance and so forth. And in fact, it will automatically integrate into your Google answers. The interesting thing is that in almost all cases when we've sold these products, the customer who purchases them does not know what kind of information they have inside their company. And they're often quite surprised to find out what they have and how much of it they have and how people really use their computer networks. So once again, information, and particular information about search, is a powerful organizing principle. To me, the most interesting aspects here are the change in computing model. As a person who spent an awful lot of time in enterprise software, the traditional model, which was largely invented by Oracle 20 years ago, was a very direct salesperson who had a multi-million-dollar software deal for a design win where you'd install your computer on your servers and so forth. It's now possible for companies like Google to completely outsource all of that. And indeed, we have a product called Google Apps for Your Domain, which allows you to outsource your calendar and your email and those kinds of things. And people are beginning to throw out some of their internal systems, the ones that are more generic, because companies like Google can literally run them and can run them safely across the internet.
Sort of like information plumbing or something.
That's right.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe I was wrong, that if you were just searching information inside a corporation, you'd have fewer privacy problems, but perhaps I was not actually.
You have privacy problems at every level of human,
Yes.
at human activity. You have privacy within the company. You also have personal privacy, and
Right.
you have the misuse of that information within a company, which can again lead to lawsuits.
You
and
mean
so
like
forth.
salary information?
Yes, of
or,
course.
Yeah.
So you have to be very, very careful how you organize your information, and tools like Google's help you figure out what's really going on.
Yeah. Another area which you mentioned it very briefly is medical information, and there's two pieces to this, or perhaps three, but the first is simply Gmail. You will store my mail, as I understand it. The architecture of how you store the mail is specifically so that you cannot search across mailboxes physically. Each mailbox is discrete and belongs to that person, and you could do the same, for example, with medical records. For millions of people, no way to search across them. Google is the sacred holder, like a bank, of individuals' information. They could provide selective access to it to doctors, hospitals, whatever. That's one interesting thing you could do. The second is you could, and here we get to this danger of evil question, you could anonymize the information, assign everybody an index number or something, and then you could actually do amazing epidemiological searches across all this information, and I think have a huge impact on medical research, on discovering correlations between diseases and behaviors, diseases and water supplies, diseases and food you ate, and so forth. Of all the companies in the world, you're probably the best equipped to do this. It's also fraught with privacy dangers. Where's your thinking about that?
Well, it's a wonderful product proposal.
Yes.
The problem, of course, is that if we actually did run across all those people's medical information, we would be violating their privacy and a fair number of laws.
Yeah.
So we can't do that product. Maybe we should, but we can't. And so the reality is there are limits to how much data mining, which is what you're describing, can be used to solve some of these problems. And we'll see. Right now, our primary focus in medical health is to get information to people. An awful lot of people use Google because I guess in medicine, mostly when you get a diagnosis of, of a disease, it has a nice long name. You type that long name in, boom, all that information is right there. And more medical professionals are doing that. We take the responsibility very seriously. Anything that involves personal medical records, real medical facts about people, is a very, very sensitive area for the reasons that you outlined.
It is, but it's also, it's a place where personalization really matters. If I've got such and such a cancer, such and such a phase, and such a genetic profile.
And you also have a tremendous interest in your own privacy.
Right, yeah. And so, again, if I trusted you, and I know there are issues there, I may trust you, but I might not trust the government not to give you a subpoena or something.
Well, indeed, people are confused about this, but we're not. We are subject to U.S. law. We're also subject to British law. We're also subject to the European Union and the laws of many, many other countries.
China, whatever.
China, et cetera. And so the fact of the matter is that we have to follow the law in these countries.
But what do you, again, look at 10 years, whether it's Google or somebody else?
Well, it's clear to me that people will take personal medical records and put them online. And with appropriate safeguards, the product that you described from Google or other companies makes an awful lot of sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense that I would have, for example, a place where I could take my medical information, and if I switched suppliers or if something happened to me or if I were incapacitated, people wanted to know what was happening to me, a loved one or whatever, it makes perfect sense.
Right. Okay, let's try a much simpler one. Because to some extent we've been talking about information that's on the web, whether it's video or audio or, of course, traditional text. There's a huge amount of information out there. This is nice and commercial, and there aren't privacy issues, there's certainly trade secret issues. Do you think everybody's inventories are going to be online and searchable in 5 to 10 years?
One of the things that people can get confused about Google is that we only search information with the permission of the publisher of that information. And there's something called a robots.txt file for web servers that they can actually just exclude us. We try to encourage them to be included. Most people find that the benefit of having their information available is outweighed by whatever economic cost there is of losing the control over it. But it's their choice, not ours. I do believe that in markets, it will be essentially impossible to have an inventory of products, for example, that's not broadly published, because so many people will be using Google and our competitors to find information that it simply won't make any sense to have it stay in the corner store and only be reachable by foot. It makes absolute sense to what's the negative, right? What's the issue? So all of these issues about privacy and publishing information have to do with two things. The first being copyright. Can you make sure that you have appropriate copyright protections, which we're working on as best we can? And the second one is issues around personal privacy or the law with respect to privacy. But aside from that, there's a bias to publishing. There's a bias to getting information out.
Yeah. Okay, so again, if I'm a retailer, I probably want to send you this stuff, and suddenly the web...
What's the negative?
Yeah,
right?
Okay. We have a question now from Tim Smart, who's asking, after this discussion, a very appropriate question. Then we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon. And that is, so with so much innovation, how do you stay focused on the core?
Well, in Google's case, we've chosen the 70% model to focus on our core search and core advertising products. And there's so much that we have not yet done in terms of better procedures, better algorithms, better knowledge, better personalization, better advertising products, better expansion, taking our advertising into new markets and so forth, that keeps us very, very busy. We're very clear as to what we do. We're a search company, and virtually everything that we do starts from search. You mentioned Gmail as an example. Gmail is really about search. And most people can't find anything because they have so much email. Right. Well, now you can search it, and you can search it in a particularly clever way. We've built a set of online applications which will be server-based and made available to anyone on the web on any device. Again, people can't find information. That's where they can search on it.
So let's move on to Google in the world. And, of course, the big controversial one is China, where you're subject to Chinese laws, and there are lots of issues. Should you be in China at all? Are you doing more good or harm there? Clearly, you think you're doing more good. Presumably, this was one of those meetings you had where there were a lot of contradictory opinions. Can you give us a sense of the pros and the cons and why you made the decision to be there?
The China decision was the hardest decision the company made, and it was a decision that took more than a year to make. I think that the pros and cons are pretty obvious. The company has held itself out as an exemplar of the right values, and no one likes censorship. On the other hand, the reality of China is that if we had not chosen to enter China, the Chinese would not have had the benefit of information on Google and the global aspects of that value, and also the local opportunities who are heavily censored would become more prevalent. So our conclusion was, and furthermore, we should say that we'd already had some experience with the Chinese government having some influence in making Google less available than it should have been. And the details were a little confused about. But nevertheless, there was no question that there was a problem with Google availability. So after a lot of discussion, we decided to invest in the Chinese citizen. What we ultimately concluded was that more information in the hands of the Chinese citizen was more likely to produce a better China. And that was a difficult decision, but we believe it was the right one.
So how much do you think the issue is, I'm a Chinese citizen, I Google something, I get more information, and something even broader, which is sort of the habit of asking questions. Even if all the information about China were censored, if I could just get in the habit of expecting answers, expecting people to respond.
In China, when we show an omitted result, we actually state that result was omitted. And the Chinese people that I know are all very, very curious. And I'm sure that they follow up.
Yeah. But beyond the Chinese people you know, I think the habit of using Google is something valuable beyond the information you get. Even if the information is missing, it changes your, like a 10-year-old kid now, wherever they live, they expect to be able to find things out in a way that a 10-year-old, 20 years ago, the only person they could ask was their parents.
Well, Google is one of a number of companies that have really changed the way in which you think about information. Wikipedia is another example of a tremendous success. And the habit of searching, the habit of looking information, the habit of checking, was that really true, what I just heard on television, is a very, very fundamental one. And I think a good one. All right, a more informed populace is one that's less likely to be affected by sort of the bad things that happen in government. What's the first thing that a bad dictator does? They shut down the borders, they put tanks around the television stations, and they shut off all external communications. It's extremely difficult to do that with the internet. It's extremely difficult to do that with Google.
Yeah. Though in the end you need courage as well as information to act.
But people are courageous.
Yeah.
There are many, many leaders in these societies who, empowered with information, will do the right thing as they see it.
Okay, another question now from David Butcher. Why wouldn't you work with governments to make the relevant material available with permission, thus performing a wonderful public service? I'm not sure what relevant material this is, but medical information or...
Well,
talk about how you work with governments, I guess is the question.
Well, first place, governments move on a different timeline than companies like Google. So we have a bias toward getting more information generally available or make it more accessible with people's permission. In government's case, there are laws that restrict that sort of thing, but we talk to them, and most people are amenable to this. With respect to censorship, censorship emanates from government. And my own view is that this online lifestyle, of which Google is a representative, will become a bigger and bigger temptation for governments, both the good ones and the bad ones, to monitor their citizens, to know what they're doing. In the United States, we're fortunate that we have a court system which can actually check the power of the executive. And in this particular, recently we had a subpoena that was for a broad set of things which didn't make any sense to us, and a judge agreed with us. It's important that the check and balance that exist in modern governments be used to make sure that particular agendas, particular goals in the political process be checked by what's right and fair for everybody.
Yeah. How much do you see yourselves acting alone, and how much do you work with Yahoo, Microsoft, AOL, other companies in the industry to...
This has been historically a relatively isolated industry with each of the company working on themselves. Yeah. That has recently changed. Barry Diller led an initiative of a whole bunch of us to get together, to his credit, to work on net neutrality. And
Barry Diller of Interactive
Barry Diller of Interactive IAC, and a very, very interesting fellow. And Barry pushed hard the notion of trying to have an equal playing field for how people will get access to information. It's one of the fundamental principles of how the Internet is organized, and we feel very strongly that that's an initiative. There are others around privacy, security, pornography, and those sorts of things, where we're trying to get to common outcomes. As corporations, and as leaders in these corporations, we benefit from standardization of policies. We benefit from having more common practices between the United States and Europe, for example. It just makes our lives easier and more effective.
Yeah, and other parts of the world. Yeah. So, parse for me what's going on with the Hewlett-Packard board. That's an interesting tale about access to information, corporate governance. You're on not just your own board, but Apple's board.
I've just joined the Apple board. You have some sort of a failure in that scenario. There's a great line this morning in the paper that leaks seem to emanate from ships that are sinking. And I hope that's not true for HP.
Yeah.
What I do know is that this leak culture is emblematic of problems. People who are dissatisfied, people who see a different alternative, people who are unhappy with their leadership, etc. And it's obvious that there was an overreaction on the part of the board, and I wasn't there, I don't really know. But part of the secret is to have a strong spirit about what the company is trying to do, to make sure that the people who are in the company share in this spirit, and that everyone is transparent with respect to each other as to what they're doing.
Yeah, though in this case the leaks weren't emanating from the ship.
Right.
They were emanating from the cockpit.
Well, even worse.
Yeah.
Even worse.
Yes.
So both an inappropriate set of leaks and a very inappropriate set of responses.
Yeah. From Andrew Vorster of Visa, do you have a recommendation for corporations' approach to data in the future? Traditionally, corporations have classified data in outdated taxonomies that are not relevant in a world that Googles for its data. So I guess a little bit about information architecture.
Well, there's a large body of work and companies that organize information in very complicated ways. And most of those information repositories are so highly specialized that only a small number of users can get to them. One of the great things about the web is people have built essentially front ends which will take that information out of these highly sophisticated databases and put them in a webified format so they can literally be searched. So the focus should not be so much on what is the underlying information architecture that you use, because maybe there's a reason to use a special one, but rather figure out a way to get it into a format that can be searched and indexed within your company. The simple answer to that is put it on a web page.
Yeah.
So the simple answer, and so for a chief information officer who's looking at this, make a list of all the databases that your company has, which by the way is always
more
a
than
surprise.
you think.
It's always a surprise. And then put a check next to each one of those where there is a web interface, just the information in the information. And then we and others can search it. But you'll discover that there's a very large number of databases that very few people use, and that drives your costs up a great deal.
So,
and I should mention, by the way, that in this emergent new model where applications are in the servers and the clients are relatively low-end, right? You have handhelds, you have mobile, low-end mobile devices. Obviously, the mobile phones are growing much more quickly than PCs. It'll be even more important to have standardized interfaces, right, which is typically search.
Yes.
So put another way, you've just spent $100 million on some very, very expensive database inside of a company which 50 people use. You're really not getting the benefit of all of that. You're really not getting the kind of information transfer, the kind of analysis that could be done if that interface had been made with a web interface. It was available on everybody's cell phones.
Yeah. And then there are two more things to explore on this question. One is simply the dynamic nature of all this. Things continually get updated, and if you try and build a data structure too early, you suddenly discover, I had diesel fuel and then I had, some other kind of fuel, but suddenly now we have alternative energy sources, and you really want to restructure the taxonomy entirely. So that argues again for not wasting too much time on structure.
Let me just be even more precise. Yeah. You can design the way you think the world is organized, or you can let the world organize itself and you can search against it.
Right. And update.
It. We have a strong view of the latter.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, businesses and information are about empowering people, and people are very clever at taking information and organizing it in a way that makes sense to them. The more centralized your approach, the tighter you are that you control both the taxonomy and the structure of information, the less likely anyone or anything useful is going to come out of it.
Yeah. So, in a sense, you're a company that was founded on an algorithm that used metadata, which was the webmaster's links. And now we're in a world with a lot more types of metadata. There's dates, which are really important for blogs and news. But there's this whole explosion of tagging, which it's not so much a structure as a filter. I want things tagged X by these kinds of people, or I want clusters. How is tagging going to fit into what you do in the future?
Well, let's think about the question of ranking photographs or blogs.
Yeah.
In the normal web structure, the link algorithms and the other techniques work very well. But it's very difficult if you just see a photograph, if you're a computer anyway, to figure out how to organize it. Is this more important than the other one, and so forth. And so things like tagging, and indeed Google and many other companies now support tagging, allows a user to generate it. There are two categories. There's defined tags where you can essentially there's a previously defined
list of
tags, or you can just invent your own. it's pretty clear to me that tags will become one of the fundamental ways in which people both manage and monitor user-generated data. People are already using tags for things like discovering pornography, inappropriate content, violence, those sorts of things, because frankly, when people see it, they know that they're seeing it, and boom, and they're happy to tag it. So it's likely that virtually all of the interesting ranking algorithms will use tags as one of their inputs to rank and organize and eventually filter, if you need to filter out inappropriate content, especially in areas where there's not a lot of other structure.
Yeah. And where is Google in terms of making use of that?
Well, indeed, we use this information already when we're dealing with multimedia content.
But what about in news content, or sort of as part of the basic search algorithms?
Well, we've made a distinction between the traditional web search, which is sort of integrated, and some of these new things, which are, again, I mentioned photographs and blogs, which we've kept largely separate, because the algorithms and structure are really quite different, and we'll merge them as long as the signals are good. Frankly, whenever we look in those spaces, their ability to rank and sort them is not as good as our core web search, which is used by so many different people.
Right. Okay, so we're coming pretty close to the end. I want to know what I haven't asked that you'd like to talk about.
Well, I think that the thing that people don't appreciate is how fundamental the change in the last few years is in terms of computer architecture. And I'll give you many examples. You and I both grew up in an industry where the personal computer was invented. All of your data was on your personal computer. If you dropped it, you were hosed, big trouble, that sort of thing. And the important thing here is that there is a new model. And the new model is that your personal information, your company information, and the world's information is kept in a cloud. It's kept in a place that British Telecom hosts, to use an example. And that information is available on every device. And the utility of this is obvious. We've talked about this for a long time. Do you know what kind of servers Google or eBay or Yahoo uses? You don't need to know. They're always there and they work well. That's a change. Even more fundamental is that it's now possible to, through technologies which are known as AJAX, which is a technical term referring to the technology that it actually uses, it's actually possible for the applications that you used to download onto your personal computer to be made available to you through the net. This change, again, is a huge change in utility, because now all of a sudden I can walk up to any device, I can carry any device, and I see the same information. So the way I would say it is that we spent 15 years talking about convergence of devices. And all these people said there's only going to be one device, it's going to have a TV in it, and a phone, and a headset, and a keyboard, and God knows, and that's completely wrong. It's clear that there will be many devices, right? Most people that I know have 2 or 3 or 4 that they carry with them at any given time. You probably have even more, knowing you. And the important point is those devices will see the same information. So the convergence is that the information and your ability to access it, the devices will differ based on form factor and personal choice. This is a big change. And it's going to drive economics, it's going to drive how people make money, drive the whole industry in some new directions.
And at the same time, some of the devices will subset the information differently, because the stuff you want when you're on your cell phone is different from what you want when you're in a room with a big screen. I mean, everything from thumbnails to one restaurant result to a click to phone somebody or that kind of thing.
People will want to get all the same information with every kind of device, but not every device is created equal. And so software will adapt, right, the information. But the fact of the matter is that people are sitting on subways. They're going to want to be searching. They're going to be playing games. They're going to be looking at the news and listening to listening to music. And they're going to want to do that just the same way they do in their homes.
Right. And Google the guy they just saw on the street, or the restaurant they were in, whatever. Okay, well, I want to thank you. I want to thank the audience very much. This is part of a series. You're lucky to be the first, and we're grateful to you for being the first.
Thank you very much, Esther. It's been a privilege to work with you for so many years. I'm happy to do this.
And it's not over yet. There's also going to be several more of these BT sessions over the next few months, and everybody who's here today is invited to rejoin us. Thank you.